You've probably driven by it many times without thinking about it, maybe without even noticing it. After all, it's just a narrow trench full of water by the Madaket Road. I wasn't really familiar with it myself until I saw a brief mention of it in Nathaniel Philbrick's 1993 book, Away Offshore. But the Madaket Ditch is in fact one of the most historic places on Nantucket. It was built in a combined effort of Wampanoag Indians and English settlers, and that was more than 350 years ago. The Madaket Ditch may be the oldest human-made structure on Nantucket. The ditch connects Long Pond to Hither Creek, and thus to Madaket Harbor. It begins here on Nantucket Land Bank Commission property on the west side of Long Pond. The ditch is about 3,500 feet long and 10 feet wide. Its depth ranges from about a foot to 5 or 6 feet. The water flow is tidal, and here at its eastern end it's minimal, but it's enough that island naturalist Ginger Andrews has seen barnacles in Long Pond's brackish water. The ditch begins in more or less a straight line, but after about 600 feet it begins to curve due to obstacles that were once there. Nantucket historian Francis Cartinen says that, for example, in one area the diggers had to detour around a large oak tree. The ditch's water tends to be a dark, opaque brown. The bottom tends to be mucky and peaty, but longtime island resident Paul Bennett told me that in some places it has hard-packed dirt that you can walk on. He's seen folks wade across the ditch. But it has no sandy beach, only grassy, soily edges. The ditch is maintained, but over the centuries it has not been on a regular basis. Longtime Madaket resident Bill Greeter has a story about that.
Walter Barrett was a Nantucket icon. Years back when I was a young lad, I was at a town meeting and there was a big discussion about the maintenance of the ditch. And after a lot of back and forth, Walter stood up and said, you know, those ditches were dug by the Indians. They're good enough for them. They're good enough for me.
I remember Walter Barrett, and although I didn't know him personally, I do know that when Walter Barrett spoke, people listened. Why does the ditch exist? At a meeting on Nantucket in 1665, Wampanoags and English settlers agreed to construct the ditch together so that they could all catch alewives and eels. Alewives, a species of herring, live in salt water and spawn in fresh water, while eels do the opposite. The ditch would connect the salt water of Hither Creek in the west to what had been the fresh water of Long Pond in the east, thus attracting both fish. The Indians and the settlers would equally divide their catches at a low dam at the ditch's mouth. The agreement also stated that the ditch would be used to create a meadow, but for use by the settlers only. Lifelong Nantucket fisherman Carl Sherlin told me that the settlers would have wanted to grow salt hay for animal fodder. In 1676, 11 years after the ditch's construction, Nantucket's proprietors transferred the exclusive fishing rights to the settlers Thomas Macy and Peter Coffin, thus removing the rights of the Wampanoag. The reasons why are lost to history, but Mashpee Wampanoag tribesman Darius Coombs told me that it probably had to do with King Philip's War, named for the Wampanoag chief whose forces at that time were fighting bloody battles against settlers in many areas of New England, including Cape Cod. King Philip had in fact made a trip to Nantucket around 10 years before, and while it had been peaceful, it had also been adversarial. In 1841, Nantucket's proprietors ceded their ownership of the ditch to the town of Nantucket, and in that same year the town widened it. Seines were not to be allowed for fishing, but scoop nets were, and only on designated days. Nowadays, the town has a moratorium on alewife fishing. According to town manager Libby Gibson and town natural resources director Jeff Carlson, present ownership of the ditch is not clear, but it's probably the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and not the town of Nantucket. I'm standing in the Madaket Swamp. I'm only a few feet north of the ditch, most of the way down to Hither Creek. It may not look like a swamp because there's not a whole lot of water here and there's pretty low vegetation, but this is where the English settlers probably were growing that salt hay. The swamp covers more than 50 acres and it's divided up into dozens of parcels, a mixture of private land and conservation land. The swamp also contains several additional crisscrossing ditches, all of them arrow straight and eventually flowing into the Madaket Ditch. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, dug them in the 1930s for mosquito control. Just to the west, the ditch flows through the culvert underneath North Cambridge Street. Plenty of space exists there for the higher waters that occur due to tidal flow, which at this end is normally about 2 feet. But in storms, this culvert can be filled. The ditch then travels another 600 or 700 feet before emptying into Hither Creek, once again on land bank property. We live in an era of rising sea levels, and because of that, the ditch and this entire surrounding area is going to undergo radical changes over the next several decades. To find out what that's going to look like, I contacted Vince Murphy, who is Nantucket's Coastal Resilience Coordinator. Vince, what can you tell us?
Yeah, we are here at Madaket Ditch. It's just a little after high tide, and today's this area also floods, and today's flood zones are tomorrow's high tide zones. As sea levels rise, we're expecting in Nantucket somewhere in the region of 2 to 6 feet, where we end up with anywhere from ankle deep to waist deep water in this area. And that will have, that's at high tide on a normal day. That will have a dramatic effect on the vegetation in this area and in the ditch and in the ditch banks. What that will do is it'll change it from this nice lush green vegetation we have here to cause some marsh migration and change in the vegetation type to become lower, more salt resistant vegetation, and to the vegetation being lost in general. And this area will end up potentially being covered at almost every high tide and will become a mud flat of sorts.
Well, that may not be an agreeable scenario, but it is a science-based one.
Oh, it is. This is a heavily studied area at the moment. We're looking at the various different NOAA projections for 2030, 2050, 2070 and 2100. And those NOAA projections show this area, the wetland in this area expanding, then suddenly it changes around the 2050, 2070 time frame to being permanently underwater at high tide, and then in the future this could even be underwater at low tide. The town mainly uses NOAA, but we also use Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, another different type of model that the state developed, and it's something we're moving towards.
In 2021, the Land Bank Commission built a brand new boardwalk leading to a brand new viewing platform. I'm standing on that platform right now. Behind me and to my right is where the Madaket Ditch empties into Hither Creek. If you want to explore the Madaket Ditch, and I would certainly encourage you to do so, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. Number one, the flora and fauna. There is a bit of poison ivy in some small pockets, just keep an eye out for that. And as far as the creatures in the ditch, in addition to the alewives and the eels, you might run into a crab, you might run into a snapping turtle. Number two, it's usually hard to figure out how deep the ditch is at any given point. And in most parts of the ditch, for most people, it will be over your head. Third, if you step into the water at the ditch and you touch bottom, you're stepping into muck. And the problem there is you don't know how far you're going to sink into that muck. Fourth, and this may be most important, when you step into that muck and stir it up, you're stirring up contaminants that have gotten into the ditch's water from Long Pond. Long Pond is right next to the Nantucket dump, and those contaminants you would be stirring up, you're not going to have any idea what they are. And finally, number five, most of the land on either side of the ditch is privately owned, so please respect the property owner's rights. I have to wonder what the Wampanoags and the settlers would think if they saw the Madaket Ditch today, 357 years after they dug it out. Would they be surprised that it's still here? Would they be mystified by the pollution that's now in it? Would the settlers wonder where their salt hay was? I like to think that they'd be proud that their work still existed in 2022. But how would they react to rising seas flooding this area and eventually destroying the ditch? Or would they even believe that that could happen? I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Madaket Ditch. For Nantucket Community Television, I'm Charley Walters.